Welcome back to the Hero Report. As always, I am Ari Cohen, and with me is Matt Langdon. How are you, Matt?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing fine, thanks. Nice to see you here. And I wanted to comment, of course, the balloon that's behind your head. I know that people who are listening on iTunes, not watching, they won't be able to see this, but it's pretty great, especially given what we're going to talk about today. We're continuing on with the subject that we began last week. We're talking about comic book heroes. Sometimes, to accommodate me, not a reader of comics, we talk about comic book hero portrayals in film, which I think is actually useful because obviously it's a really mass market way for people to get their dose of heroism. And we talked last time, I listen every time we record a show, I listen back to it before it gets published. And I realized listening back to last week's show that I really took it easy on the movie version of Thor. And I really shouldn't have. I think we ended up talking about whether or not it was an okay choice to make it less about Thor and human villains, or Thor in the realm of the gods. And that's really what we ended up talking about. But I just wanted to say for a minute before we move on to today's topic, it really was a dreadful movie. I talked a lot about how bad I thought Captain America turned out. But Thor and Captain America are really, they're sort of racing for the bottom there together. And I just had to throw that out. I couldn't let people believe that there was something about Thor that I found endearing or useful or, well, anything like that.
So just making sure we protect your reputation as a film critic, right?
That's right, since that's obviously what I do in my spare time. And the thing about Thor, maybe I should just say for a minute, the thing about Thor that really bothered me was just the way that Kenneth Branagh filmed the movie. There was both the filming element, the cinematography, the way it looked so fake. There wasn't a thing about the movie that looked real. From the sets, which were all CGI'd, to the costumes, which looked like they were painted on the actors and super shiny, to the airbrushing of Natalie Portman's face. There was no reason to do some of the things that they did, but it was worse than the George Lucas refilmings of scenes in Star Wars in terms of the way that it looked. When you were, in the realm of Thor and his kind, there wasn't a single thing that looked even remotely realistic. And that I thought was really sad. But I also thought that the story was really sad, poorly done, because what this sets up, I don't know. Maybe I'll be proved wrong. But I could see the entire first Avengers film being about Natalie Portman constructing a bridge. That's where we're left. At least with Captain America, they put Captain America in modern times. They set up a connection to Iron Man. Here, the bridge is broken.
Right.
And I have no more patience for that. That would be like watching all of the, it'd be like watching Superman's real father on Krypton, just playing with Superman's toes for 2 hours. This little super piggy went to market. This little super piggy went home. I appreciate that they tried to give us a quest, and they tried to make it a reasonable quest for someone who is otherworldly. Right? I appreciate that, and that's what we talked about last time. But there has to be a better way to do it, right? The only thing they could come up with was to make him not otherworldly, right? They made him human for the central part of the film, and then in the end, he becomes otherworldly again, and that's the only way that he succeeds. And I think that's well, that's a bit of a letdown, perhaps.
Right. And I think, there's that limitation that we talked about last week of what stories you can tell about someone who's invulnerable. And a god on Earth is not a very interesting story generally unless they have lost their powers, right?
Right.
And I think my big concern coming out of the movie was that, and I can't, it tells you a lot that I can't even remember what the point was, but he essentially made a very important decision based on his love for the Natalie Portman character. And it took, we had 3 minutes of establishing a love story there. And again, that's just part of a story that's completely missing. And yet we're supposed to understand why he would give up whatever he gave up.
I think you should, I hesitate to say that you should watch it again. I don't think anyone should watch it again. But he just, so a spoiler alert for people who really wanted to see it, stop listening now. But he destroys the bridge that connects their planets, realms, whatever, which means he might not be able to get back to see his beloved Natalie Portman. But it's a sacrifice that he makes because otherwise this other planet or realm or whatever is going to be destroyed by his nefarious half-brother, foster brother. It's a planet, of course, filled with enemies, people who he recently tried to attack and destroy, but he doesn't want the planet to be destroyed or harmed. So he destroys the bridge, which is harming that other planet, and that leaves Natalie Portman, who is, of course, a physicist, to maybe try to find some way to build the bridge again. But, the answer to your question, Matt, is really simple. Why does he like Natalie Portman?
Because she's Natalie Portman.
It's
right?
Natalie Portman! It's a good thing my wife is too busy to listen to these podcasts because, of course, she knows that we have to limit the number of Natalie Portman films that we can watch here in the house. So that it's a reasonable amount. It wouldn't be a good idea to spend too much more of our podcasting time talking about Natalie Portman. Nonetheless, I just had to get that out there. That's enough about Thor. That's more words than needed to be spoken about Thor, actually. But it takes us, I think, nicely into the topic that we wanted to talk about this time, and that, of course, is the opposite of Thor, right? Thor, of course, is this golden god who, despite having some trouble at the beginning, does everything right in the end, right? He proves himself worthy of his hammer, and he does the right thing, and so on. The same cannot be said for a great many comic book heroes, especially, I guess, from sort of the 1980s onward, right? And maybe you know more about the actual comic timeline, so maybe I'll turn it over to you to give us a little bit of that.
Yeah, well, I think there was it'd be the end of the 80s, I think, and start of the 90s, there was a real, I think, reaction to those perfect superheroes, and the reaction was to go dark and to really look at the psychology of people that would dress up in costumes and fight crime, particularly those without superpowers. So Batman was part of that, and there were a number of comic books that came out that weren't about superheroes at all or heroic behavior at all. And then the big moment after the Dark Knight sort of revisioning of Batman was The Watchmen, and The Watchmen was, I think, really designed as a I think I remember Alan Moore, the writer, saying that it was supposed to, that no one would be able to write a superhero story after The Watchmen came out because it was deconstructing the whole idea of superheroes and what would really happen if people started dressing up and actively fighting crime, and what would really happen if there was a Superman on Earth. So from there, it was just, it had the opposite effect. I think people were like, oh my God, I'm going to write my dark and dirty superhero who doesn't care about the law and carries weapons and kills people, and I think we're still feeling that today. And I think a couple of years ago, another genre came out where it was really imagining. It was kind of meta. It was imagining comic book fans deciding to become comic book heroes. And we got Kick-Ass out of that, and numerous others as well, where it was really building off that again with we normal average comic book readers deciding we were going to do something about it. And I think that currently we have a lot of people out there actively acting as superheroes. So it's an interesting 20 years of development.
Yeah. And so, I think that the funny thing about this, from the perspective of people who are interested in heroism, as things got darker, it became a lot more challenging to talk about these characters as straightforwardly heroic. Sometimes impossible to talk about them that way. But it also obviously sparked people's imagination in a really radically different way. It got people even people who were already interested in Batman, it sort of changed the way they thought about Batman in some sense. And for a lot of people, made it more appealing. The darkness made it more appealing because it's not straightforward. There's a debate that one can have about that person's actions, whereas the goody-goody superhero, there's no debate. There's nothing that challenges us, that makes us wonder about this person's motivations. And of course, this is translated into big-budget, blockbuster movies that are, as I said in our podcast last week, I think the best of the genre films. Because that's what you want in a story. You want something that's not, I think, so straightforward, that gives you something to wrestle with.
Right, absolutely. I think, they're focusing on, the movies and the comics are focusing on debate rather than spectacle. And so they're much more rewarding movies. They're much more interesting to watch. They're much more interesting to go with a group of friends to and come out talking about it. No one comes out talking about the philosophy or the decisions in Thor or Superman. They come out talking about the big explosions, which weren't that fantastic in Thor again.
Well, that's the problem with Thor, right? There is no decision making.
Right.
There's there is learning. The character learns something from beginning to end. He was spoiled and petulant and aggressive, and now he's nice. But why? Well, because he got punished. Mostly because he got punished, and maybe also because of Natalie Portman, but mostly because he got punished by his dad.
Absolutely.
And what's interesting about that? And I think that is what I think is so fascinating about the Batman films and of course the Watchmen as well, is that it drops you into this very dark world, and you really have to kind of fend for yourself if you're trying to think about things from the moral perspective, right? You have to sort out what you think about these characters. Sometimes they'll do a little bit for you, but a lot of the time these are open questions about how we should feel about these characters' actions. And I think that for me is one of the real fascinating things.
Yeah, definitely. And ultimately, we want to be talking about heroism, and that's what it comes down to, is at what point does heroic behavior become disqualified? And is it, does it have anything to do with laws, or does it have anything to do with the objective goodness or badness of the person, doing the thing that the hero is trying to stop, or the main character is trying to stop, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's probably our central question here, right? Because all of the behavior of the characters could be described as vigilantism, right? Rather than heroism. These are people who ultimately mostly they mask who they are, or they're anonymous in some way, and they go out often at night and they take the law into their own hands. Right? Now, it turns out that what they're doing is they're helping. Whether or not we understand that at first, right? This is the classic thing about Batman. Maybe we don't see him as doing the thing that helps us right away, but later we come to understand that he's really got our best interest at heart. But you know, it seems to me that this is what we want to know. Where does that line get drawn? Where is it that we say, well, this is a step too far, right? I didn't mind you costuming up and you know, punching out the bank robber, but I did mind X. This was too much. What is that X? What's too much? What makes someone a vigilante and not a hero?
Right. Well, there's the big part of that story is the law, right? And a hero almost has to be ready to break the law. There's so many examples in history where the law keeps us from heroism. But yeah, vigilantes. I mean, essentially, it comes down to whether they've made a mistake or not. I think, right? So yes, you're commended for stopping the bank robber, but what if you made a mistake and that person wasn't a bank robber and you've just punched them in the face? That's when, well, hang on, you did the wrong thing, and I think ultimately that's the issue that comes into play with Batman in the second movie, particularly, is how can we trust that one person to make the right decision when our society is based on judging with a jury, or making laws with a group of people that one person shouldn't be judge, jury, and executioner, which is ultimately what the vigilante is. And that the other big piece of the definitions in these characters is whether the hero or the vigilante is willing to take a life based on their decisions. And that speaks to you with the with death sentencing. Who wants one person to be walking around deciding whether someone dies or not based on their assumption on wrongdoing?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think that this sort of signals a real discomfort that I have with the vigilante hero films and comics, and increasingly also we have television shows that are good examples of this too, right? The one that I think most people think of or ought to think of is Dexter on Showtime, because that's exactly what Dexter is. And he every week he takes the law into his own hands and he kills someone. And the person is always deserving of death, as far as Dexter is concerned, right? It's a criminal who's gotten away with murder. And luckily, he's around to make sure that the person no longer will get away with murder, or didn't actually get away with it, but gets his or her comeuppance in the end. But there's something really uncomfortable about rooting for that kind of hero, right? I really wonder... and I think actually The Watchmen is a good example of this. There's something very uncomfortable about hoping for the best for some of these characters, right? I mean, what does it mean about us if we straightforwardly want these people to succeed in their endeavors?
Well, The Watchmen, I think, was a really... I mean, there's been a lot said about The Watchmen, but it did a really good job of presenting the different motivations and actions of characters. So you had the Night Owl character who was, he really had great intentions. He wanted to be someone. He wanted to help. He wanted to do things. I think his girlfriend was the Silver Spectre, who really was doing it for a laugh. You had Rorschach, who was the the Batman, who had his own moral code and acted on it, and acted without consideration of the law, and he was happy to kill someone if it meant, that the right thing had been done. You had Ozymandias, who was looking at big picture and was wanting to save millions of lives by sacrificing hundreds or thousands, and that moral weighing up. And you had Dr. Manhattan, who sort of, because he was superhuman, he didn't relate to humans, and so they did a really good job of that. And I think the two to concentrate on in the terms of vigilantism, or the two or three, is the Silver Spectre, who's just dressing up and having some fun and a bit of adventure. You had and then a character with a real moral code who wanted to do good, or not necessarily the moral code for him, but he wanted to do good and help the law. And then you had the Rorschach character, who really was depicted to be somewhat insane, or certainly outside of the normal psychology, and he was just straightforward. He was going to do what needed to be done, and I think that plays out in these modern people dressing up as superheroes.
Mm-hmm. And that's the vigilante component, right, Matt? I mean,
right.
It's the person who has his or her own moral code that I think we're concerned with, right? Because sometimes it will line up with what we all think, and then we'll say, well, that's a good result. I'm glad someone did something. And sometimes it might not line up with what we all think, and then we have a real concern on our hands, right? Then we have someone who's just who seems mad, right? And it isn't someone that can be controlled. And I think that, for me, really highlights sort of the difference, right? People are frustrated all the time in our society that someone gets away with something on a technicality, right? There are tons of movies about this. You could look at all the headlines from the past 2 weeks and find all sorts of examples from criminal law to the world of sports, right, where a technicality frees someone. And we say that's a bad result. So the difference is when we say, let's do something about that bad result, right? Forget about the fact that we have all of these rules in place. The rules didn't help us here, right? Someone got to do what they wanted. They harmed us, or they enriched themselves, or whatever. Let's change that. Let's change the result. And sometimes I think a lot of people would be really happy with that, right? People would say, yes, this person swindled a whole bunch of people, and we'll take all that away from him, even though the law says we can't.
Right.
We'll break into his home and we'll beat him up, and we'll take all of his priceless treasures.
Right, that's where we run into the problem with this whole thing, is that mob rule, that it's very easy for a group to decide someone's wrong without even paying attention to evidence. I mean, all it takes is a convincing story, and it's over. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I looked at a couple of websites on real-life superheroes today, and interestingly, there's one that's reallifesuperheroes.org and one that's reallifesuperheroes.com. So someone missed the boat on taking both domains there. But the .org group, on their About page, it's really hard to disagree, it's hard to disagree with their About page, which says that we're using the iconicism of comic book superheroes to make a difference, inspire others, and spread a positive message.
That's nice.
Yeah, absolutely. And they want to make the world a better place by doing civic activities, charity work, public safety patrols, hospital visits, school talks, distributing missing persons flyers, helping the homeless, community cleanups, and more. And it's very hard to disagree with that. But I wonder if all of them are limiting themselves to that, because the next sentence out of the blue says, from crime fighting to charity work, real-life superheroes seek to help make a positive difference. So that group generally sounds very, very useful in the world, but You wonder what are the motivations of each person that joins in, and how many of them are seeing themselves as crime fighters, which opens up a whole bag of worms on what that means.
Yeah, I think that's something that, and yet, don't we want to say, and maybe we don't, I don't know, let's think about this for a minute. Isn't it the case that if you, let's say you're thinking about becoming a real-life superhero, right? You don't know for sure, but, maybe it appeals to you. You checked out the website, you watched the Christopher Nolan Batman films, and it appeals to you. And you're standing outside a coffee shop or whatever, and someone runs by. It seems that he's stolen a woman's purse, right? Here is your chance to be a crime fighter. So what should you do, right? Do you tackle the person? Do you make a citizen's arrest? Do you, at what point have you done a good deed, something that we would consider to be heroic, rather than simply just standing there and saying, well, not my business? And at one point, have you crossed the line? I think we all know, if you catch the guy who stole the purse and you tie him up in an abandoned warehouse, for a week and so on, you've crossed the line, right? That's a dark Batman-esque, you've turned him into a supervillain when in fact you just needed to take the purse and wait for the police to show up. But can you trip the guy? Can you punch the guy? How much is too much? When have you yourself broken a law? And maybe that's the difference. You can be a crime fighter so long as you stay within the bounds of the law. Then you're not a vigilante.
That's interesting. I'm not sure. I think you touched on what the difference is, and it comes down to whether you are working out what the punishment is for that person. So you can stop the crime, and there's going to be lots of mini decisions that have to be made there on what you need to do to stop the crime. But once you start punishing the person, that's when you've crossed the line, because that's when you've made the decision that somebody else needs to be doing, that our society has decreed should be making the decision. It absolutely should be doing what you can to stop the crime. I remember a couple of weeks ago I posted a video, it happened last year in England, where an older woman, like in her 60s, saw some people breaking into a shop, I think it was a jewelry store, and she just came up with her handbag and started hitting them over their heads with a handbag. And she's obviously, that would be against the law to hit someone over the head with a handbag, but she was intending to stop them, get them away, disperse them, whatever she could do. She wasn't, she wasn't punishing them. She was trying to stop. But yeah, you've got a point there too about when you break a law, are you automatically becoming a vigilante? And I said earlier, I think heroes have to be prepared to break the law. That at some point, at many points, laws aren't right, and we know that, and laws evolve over years. So it's hard to say, well, these laws are concrete,
Yeah, so that raises a really interesting question. Which laws can you break and still be a hero and not a vigilante, right? Because I think, and maybe people will listen to this and send us some comments, because I think vigilantism is negative, right? I wouldn't want someone to say, oh, there goes that great vigilante, right, about me. He really stepped into the breach and became quite a vigilante, is not something that we generally say with a positive outlook. So, can you break only bad laws? Who determines whether a law is bad, right? What is it because these obviously are very complicated decisions, and in many cases they have to be taken pretty quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think ultimately that you just need to basically do no harm, and it comes down to these basic tenets of being a good person. I think when you get into physical violence, there's a very thin line there. I just don't think there's room for deliberately hurting someone to stop them from doing something.
But then there's your lady with the handbag.
Right, but I don't think she was deliberately trying to hurt anyone. She was trying to disperse them and get their attention in the way that she, in the way that she could. I think when you're bringing out guns, or weapons, the intent clearly is to cause great bodily harm there, right?
Or people might say simply to stun the other person into stopping what they're doing, right? There was a piece about the city of Detroit and how the people were taking the law into their own hands, essentially, because there aren't enough police officers. And, I posted this on the blog, and the start of it was a quote from a woman who had a bunch of guns in her house and said, you got to have a lot of guns just in case people want to break in or cause trouble or whatever. Because if they know that you have a lot of guns, then they're less likely to break into your house. They're less likely to mess with you. Is that, if she prevents someone from harming others, is that right?
Right. Well, I think the thing with vigilantes is I think we associate with them a wandering around looking for opportunities to stop crime, right? That they're packing heat because they're anticipating using it. That's a problem. And heroes, when we talk about heroes generally, they're not people who are walking around looking for heroic opportunities. They're people that certainly they may be prepared for heroism, but they don't walk the streets looking for trouble. And I think that's ultimately what we see with a lot of these modern people dressing up as heroes. They're looking for something, and again, we don't know. We've got to think about intentions, whether their intentions are for some adventure in their life or excitement or whatever it might be. And you mentioned Phoenix Jones before we started the discussion. Here's a guy who does go around looking for trouble, and he's got mace in his utility belt, and he uses it. And I mean, when you go around dressed up as a superhero and you're walking around streets where there's crime and there are criminals walking the street, you're intending to spray people with that mace. You're expecting trouble, and you might misjudge what's happening. And that's where I think the problem is, that if you're looking for opportunities to be a hero, it's much easier for you to misjudge what's happening and spray an innocent person in the face with mace.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I should say, we have some people who watch this podcast as we broadcast it live on Google+, and a really interesting point was just made in the comments by Gavin, who points out that there are some laws that you might want to break, but that you can't ultimately. That there's some laws that you can't break, no matter how powerful you are. That there are only a certain set of laws ultimately that are able to be violated. And so the example he gave, which I thought was a particularly useful one, given our discussion, is that Superman can't perform legally binding same-sex marriages, no matter how unjust the law is, right? And I think that's useful, right? So we have all these people who, for whatever reason, they think that their moral code is in some sense superior to whatever society has decided at the moment. And there are some times where they actively are working against what society has determined is legal. And sometimes they're frustrated by the nature of the law itself, right? But sometimes they're not, right? You can, if it seems to you that someone needs to be put away for good, and the law won't put them away because procedurally there was some sort of problem, you can actually go after that person. We all think you shouldn't, right? But the vigilante says, well, my moral code trumps here. And that, I think, is a real challenge. There are some laws that we all might think we should overturn, but we have processes, as you've been saying, in place to try to overturn those laws.
Right.
So the idea that one person or a gang of people or whatever should take it upon themselves and say, this is taking too long, or the majority isn't doing what I think they should, that's where things get really dodgy.
Yeah, for sure. Another piece that is concerning to me with these growing number of superheroes, and they are absolutely encouraging other people to become the superhero of their city. This guy I read on the .com version, his name is Night Owl with a K, and his whole spiel is that he was an EMT in his real life and's been in the military, and he noticed that a lot of these superheroes didn't have basic what does he say, an idea on how to rescue and recover people. So he's got a website that he's trying to teach basic rescue and recovery techniques and considerations, conscious of the safety of the first responder. Now, do we want someone who doesn't know anything about being a first responder putting on a suit and going out there? I mean, this is where you can do more harm than good when you're trying to carry someone out. If you don't know what you're doing and you go to an accident, you just pick someone up and run away with them. That's where you've got spinal damage and all this kind of stuff. That, again, I think there's a big difference between a person seeing an accident and responding and someone who is actively engaged in going out looking for these opportunities to do this. And there is a difference there. There's a different expectation there, that a random person who sees a car on fire going down the street stops and they do what they can. They do to their certain level of ability. But someone who's dressing up is telling us that they have, that they are different, that there's something, that they have better skills to handle this kind of thing. And they don't, and that's a problem.
Right, they just read about it on a website.
Yeah,
I think that's a real major issue. Right now, you could look at it the other way. Right, you could take a positive spin and say, well, I saw that this is a person who's encouraging people to do this, so I'll take a course. Right, I'll get trained in first aid, or I'll volunteer at the local fire station or whatever. That's quite different, right? But if you see it and you say, oh, I could put on a cape and I could go. Just find people who need my help, and I can go help them. I read about it. That's a real problem. And I wonder, too, whether this is something that we've always seen or whether this is something really, really new and unusual. I don't have access to that information. Do you? Do you know if this is something that if this has been around for a while?
I guess I don't know either. I mean, I think obviously a lot of it comes from the availability of of the movies, particularly. I think there's always been the comics, but the movies just make it seem more vivid, right? It's not. You can see real people on the screen doing this. It's not comic book artists creating something. But I wonder. Well, obviously, we've had vigilantes. I mean, we've got the term. We know they exist. So, again, what's the difference? There's been people throughout time taking the law into their own hands.
Sure.
But maybe not as a full-time endeavor.
Right. And I think that there might, I don't know, maybe, and again, people can sort of chime in and tell us what they think about this, because I don't know the answer. It might have been the case that, the occasional person who has been, who has had something terrible happen to them, or who's had some wrong visited upon them, they want to go out and get revenge, or they want to go fix the situation. And so I'm sure, no doubt we've always had that, right? I've been personally affected, and the law isn't helping me, or there is no law, or whatever, right? A sort of Wild West kind of mentality. But I feel like there's something very different between saying, this impacted me in a certain way, and I need to do this to respond, or saying, I'm going to go and just wander around my community and see what needs to be done. And that there's something about me that means I'll be successful at this, right? That I'll find people who need help, and I'll help them. I think that there's something really unusual about that. And I don't know. Part of me, of course, wants to connect it to the nefarious influence of American Idol and all the other your special and unique talent contests that are on TV these days. Because those people really aren't that special and unique. Yeah, they just think they are.
Well, as you said, that you kind of framed it as I'm wandering around my community looking for opportunities to help. So then why do you need a mask?
Right.
There's no reason that you can't just walk around and help in your community. Absolutely, but there's something about dressing up that tells us there's something else. There's another intention there. That's
right. There are a lot of people who need someone to help carry their groceries home from the store. There are a lot of people who need the community garden to be weeded. There are a lot of people who need trash to be picked up around town. Every community could use someone who says, I have a little bit of extra time, and I'm going to repaint these people's homes. They obviously don't have time to do it. I'll ask them and see if they want me to help them do that. Yeah.
I think one of the key pieces of heroism is humility, and if you're putting on a costume to get attention for your actions, that's not being humble. There's a massive difference between standing out the front of the supermarket all day and helping people without calling attention to yourself, and there is dressing up in a costume and getting people coming to you and watching you carry groceries to the car. And obviously, by no means are we describing carrying groceries to the car as heroic. But
right.
The point is that there's a big difference between real anonymity and anonymity designed to get attention.
Mm-hmm. But I think that's a real concern, Matt, and maybe this is something we'll go out on because we've talked about this for a while, but I think this is maybe a good way to end. A lot of people, they don't view classic helping behavior as heroic. There's no adventure to it, right? There's not really a risk or a challenge. There might be some sacrifice because you could do something else with your time or your money or your goodwill, whatever. But the reason that crime fighting is what people always think of is because there's adventure there. There's a real chance to be heroic, not simply to be kind or to be helpful. And I think that's what superhero or vigilante comics and films really are kind of saying to people. There are no, I don't think, are there comic books really where people just help other people, where there's no punching or kicking or apprehending? I can't imagine, right? What would that be like? The adventures of Johnny Helper, who just goes from door to door, seeing if anybody needs their storm windows taken off because it's spring. I don't doubt for a minute that what people are thinking is, I want to do the right thing, and I want to do it in a big way, because anybody can help the person across the street, but what this community really needs is protection or an end to drug dealing or whatever, the real meat of heroic behavior.
Absolutely, and I think it would be great to get one of these superheroes on the show. Certainly, if you happen to be listening or directed to this, if you're one of these people putting on a costume, I have no doubt that there are some great intentions and would love to hear about it. So I think as I introduced it, I said that website looked like a really noble purpose. But I'm interested in hearing more about what really is going on each individual basis.
Yeah.
So we would love to have you on the show. I don't know. I don't think we're going to have a guest next week, are we?
I'm not sure. After hearing President Obama on a podcast just yesterday, I thought, well, we should invite the president and talk to him about heroism. But I suspect he'll probably need more time than just a week in order to slot us into his schedule. So I'm thinking that we may need some time. We have a few guests in the works, obviously, and those will be coming up in the next few weeks. It might be that we slot someone in for next week. It might be instead that you and I just talk. And I think, obviously, these have been a lot of fun for me and hopefully for our viewers as well, our listeners. I know, of course, that next week you're taking a trip. You're flying to the UK. So you'll have all sorts of international hijinks and hilarity. You'll be dressed up as a beef eater, I assume.
I will. I'll be eating some fish and chips during the podcast.
Good. Well, I like that because it fits sort of with the theme. Like, again, as I said, for the people who can't see you, there's a smiley face balloon just behind you, and it doesn't have like the bullet hole or with the blood coming down, but it really did put me in mind nicely this week of the Watchmen. And of course, when I saw it, as soon as we started talking, I wanted to talk all about why Thor was no good, because I had this really negative, dark impression from thinking about the Watchmen. But anyway, I think this has been a fun time. I always enjoy talking about these really challenging issues, and I think that we could probably spend more time trying to figure out what precisely it is about someone who has his or her own moral code that might present a challenge for us. And obviously, it's a topic that really interests me because all of the heroes that I ended up writing about in my book really operate under sort of their own moral code, at least for a time.
Well, I think it's a topic that, I know it's a topic that Zeno Franco enjoys thinking about and talking about, so maybe we could get him back on to speak about having a code. Next week, I'm before the podcast, I'm having dinner with the woman who invented Fraggle Rock and worked with Jim Henson on the Muppets and Sesame Street, and we are going to be talking about how to make a heroic kids TV show, or a kids TV show that teaches heroism. So I might have some things to jump right onto there, assuming I get back in time to catch you before you leave the office.
That sounds great. Yeah, I thought you were going to say the Queen when you started that sentence, but nonetheless, that's pretty good. So I'll keep working on President Obama. You get to work on Queen Elizabeth, and we'll see if we can't get either the president or some royalty on the podcast in the next few weeks.
Sounds like a plan.
Matt, thanks again. This was a lot of fun. Everyone, thanks for listening, for downloading, for watching, and for sharing with others. We'll see you next time.
And thanks, Gavin, for joining in on the comments on Google+.
Yes, absolutely. Bye-bye.